Hello everyone, welcome to a first of two lectures on the American Civil War, and in this one we'll focus on the Eastern Theater, and these lectures will be primarily focused on the military actions that took place during the war. Alright, so to set the stage, you guys have five things here that kind of get us ready for the conflict outside of what we did in the last lesson. But remember, South Carolina was the first state to secede. The Confederate states that had seceded by early February, they adopted their provisional constitution on the 7th in 1861. And during this period of time, when the sides themselves were actually feeling themselves out and trying to gather materials, but also enter into peace negotiations, the southern states were more active in trying to seize anything they could that was of military value. But it was important to know that the reason why this period took place is because each side didn't want to be viewed as the aggressor. Now, in terms of war itself, the peace negotiations kept breaking down, mainly because President Lincoln didn't want to enter in negotiations with the Confederate government. He would only enter negotiations with the state governments because it was a recognition issue, and he viewed that if he recognized them, that it was giving them validity to their cause. Now, Lincoln on several occasions had to deal with isolated federal garrisons, the most famous being at Fort Sumter, and he actually authorized in early April a relief force to be sent there because it was running out of food and it was really short on men, and it was surrounded in Charleston Harbor. So the Confederates, a little over a week later after this authorization, actually started bombarding the fort. And this is what is traditionally looked at as the first actual action of the war. Now, the Union troops surrendered the next day. There were no casualties during the actual military action of this event, although there were a couple in the formal surrender ceremony because of a charge went off mistakenly. Now, this is going to be the event that actually sparks the war. So once the war is sparked, the South, they gain a great opportunity of boosting the morale, but it also helps the North as well because it rallies those that were actually against the war in favor of putting down the Southern threat militarily because the South shot first. But the problem was the North, even though it had more men, particularly in population, than the South, they didn't have a strong army. It was only about 16,000 men, which was not even close to being strong enough. So they needed troops. So Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to enlist for 90 days because they thought that the war was going to be quick. And this was answered quickly throughout most states in the North. But unfortunately for the president, it angered four more states in the South, in particular the big ones were Virginia and North Carolina, as well as Arkansas and Tennessee, you can see there, into seceding and joining the Confederate States. So this made it an even bigger conflict, and the Union losing more land to the Confederacy. Now, initially in the war, the Union Commander-in-Chief, General Winfield Scott, he put forth a plan called the Anaconda Plan, and basically it was a plan that was set up to blockade all of the southern ports and slowly constrict the South into defeat. And it basically was designed, outside of the constriction, was to help cut the South up, make it a lot more manageable by conquering it piece by piece slowly. Particularly by splitting the South at the Mississippi River and so forth. Now, the plan was actually hated by a lot of people because they looked at it as it was too slow, and that was because of the idea that everybody thought the war was going to be very quickly. Now, this plan would actually take shape and help win the war. Now, the first major battle that we look at is Bull Run or Manassas, depending on which side you're ally with. But both sides, like I said, they looked for a quick war. The battle took place in mid to late July 1861, Now, initially in that battle, the Union forces had gained the upper hand. It looked like they were going to defeat the Confederate forces. But General Jackson of the Confederacy, his brigade went on top of Henry House Hill and stood tall and defended the hill and the artillery that was there valiantly, and he gained the nickname Stonewall in this engagement. Now, he counterattacks along with cavalry from Jeb Stuart, and they capture the Union guns that are facing them, and this turns the tide of the battle. And ultimately, the Union forces are routed, and they run all the way back to Washington. And this Confederate victory actually ends the prospects of a short war. So after this, it's going to be a long and bloody war. All right, next, the Carolina campaign. This is kind of a general one. It moved pretty quickly in 1861 and went throughout until the end of the war. Union forces under Benjamin Butler and Ambrose Burnside actually invaded the Carolina coast, in particular North Carolina, and their goal was working concurrently with the Anaconda Plan to secure ports to enhance the Union blockade. Now, there were various battles, we won't get into them because they're not terribly significant, that were working to improve that blockade and bring the South to its knees, at least economically. And the campaign would actually end in roughly around February of 1865 with the capture of Wilmington, which at the time was the last major seaport that the South had control of by that point in the war. Now on to more of the campaign back into Virginia. In the spring of 1862, the Union forces were threatening the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, which was the South's breadbasket. It was where they got the majority, at least in the Eastern Theater, of their resources for their army to function. Now, Stonewall Jackson was sent there to combat this threat. He was outnumbered, but he was a very, very capable commander and moved very quickly. And over the period of 3 to 4 months, he actually fought a series of battles against multiple armies. Now, he wasn't victorious in every single one of them. Most he was. But ultimately, really what he did is he prevented the Union occupation of the valley, so it kept that as a southern resource. But the main thing, at least militarily, was he prevented thousands of Union troops from moving from the Shenandoah to the east to reinforce against McClellan's offensive that was against Richmond, the Confederate capital. Now, furthermore, let's go to the Peninsula Campaign in this offensive. So, George McClellan, who was the commander of the Union forces, he landed with over 100,000 men at Fort Monroe, which is at the tip of the Virginia Peninsula, and his goal was to drive up the peninsula and capture Richmond. But the problem was, as McClellan, although he was a very great organizer and trainer of troops, he moved very, very slowly, and he allowed himself to be pinned in and allowed the Confederates to delay him. And the Confederates just fought a series of delaying actions up the peninsula to buy time to get more troops and to Richmond and bolster the defenses there. Now, one of the big battles was the Battle of Seven Pines, and it was an inconclusive battle fought outside of Richmond, but it stopped the Union advance. That was the big thing for the Confederacy. Now, another advantage for them was their commander, Joseph E. Johnston, was wounded, and that is what allowed Robert E. Lee to be put in command of what would become the Army of Northern Virginia and change the war, at least for the next year or so. Now, after the Battle of Seven Pines, there was a series of battles, which was just really a continuation of the Peninsula Campaign, known as the 7 Days Battles. There were 6 battles fought over 7 days, and Lee, in these battles, slowly drove McClellan away from Richmond and back down the peninsula, although they weren't all victories for Lee. Now, Lee was stopped at Malvern Hill, which backed up against the James River, because he went in at a costly frontal assault. And this basically preserved McClellan's position. But again, he acted very slowly and he was very cautious. So even though he still outnumbered Lee, he was coming off of a decently respectable victory, he retreated to Harrison's Landing. And this ends officially the Union attempt to drive on Richmond at this point in the war. McClellan is actually going to be relieved from command essentially at this point. Now, the next great battle is at Second Bull Run or Manassas, the exact same site as the first one, just on a much larger scale. Now, what happens is Lee is not scared of McClellan because he knows how slow he's reacting and how cautious he is. So he leaves a skeleton force to kind of pin him in, and he turns his army to attack the new Union army under John Pope into the north of Virginia. Now, this army is known as the Army of Virginia, so don't get confused by Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. But Pope is more aggressive, and that was why he was put in command. But Lee is smarter. He lures him into a trap. And using Stonewall Jackson, who digs in behind a railroad embankment, which is a great defensive position for him, because it was slightly uphill, and you guys can see it in the top picture, the Union attacks are frontal assaults and they fail. Okay, well, while this is going on, Lee had split his forces. His other commander, James Longstreet, attacks on the Union flank and routs Union forces, and we have another Union commander that is relieved of command, John Pope. So, furthermore, we're going to move a little bit here back in the fight at Hampton Roads. Hampton Roads was a very important action in history, not just in the Civil War, because on March 8th of 1862, the CSS Virginia, which used to be the USS Merrimack, which had been converted to an ironclad warship by the Confederacy and given the name Virginia, starts to destroy ships along or near Hampton Roads of the Union blockade. The next day, a new invention of the United States Navy, the USS Monitor, which was also an ironclad ship. You can see down there at the bottom, the Monitor is the one that has like the little, looks like half a can on the top of it. It was a rotating turret based ironclad, engages with the Virginia. Now, this was the first engagement between ironclad vessels in the history of warfare. The battle is inconclusive. They didn't have armor-piercing rounds. They weren't able to damage really anything on both ships that put them out of action. But the Union blockade was preserved, and that was important. So the Virginia wasn't able to break the blockade. Now, back to the war on land. After Lee's victories in the 7 Days Battle and Second Manassas, Lee decides he has a lot of power. A lot of things are going for him, so he invades Maryland. He turns north. He's trying to take pressure off of Virginia and the southern economy, as well as put more pressure on the Union forces, in particular the government and their commanders. So he goes north into Maryland. He divides his army. He sends some of Jackson's men to take the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. McClellan is reinstated to command the Army of the Potomac after a short firing, and the campaign moves actually fairly quickly, even though McClellan's in command. And the reason why that is because Union soldiers actually capture a set of Lee's plans, and McClellan, for the first time in the war, and actually really the only time in the war, acts quickly, and he traps Lee's army near Sharpsburg, Maryland. Now, this action actually leads to one of the most famous battles and important battles of the war, and it's the Battle of Antietam, or Sharpsburg, depending on which side you affiliate yourself with. Now, the battle begins on September 17th, although there were several skirmishes in the days before at South Mountain and other actions. But McClellan, again, outnumbers Lee significantly. But he attacks piecemeal, which means he only attacks with single portions of his army at a time. His first attack is to the north in the battlefield, where he uses Joseph Hooker to attack Lee's left across a miller's cornfield. It becomes very, very hard-fought battle there, a lot of casualties. After that attack pretty much fizzles out, McClellan moves south to the middle of the battlefield, where he uses Sumner's Corps to attack near what is known as the Dunker Church. You can see that in the upper picture there, and attack against the Sunken Lane, which was a natural defensive position for the Confederate troops. And those attacks suffer heavy casualties again. Now, the third attack although it's going to go very slowly, was done by Ambrose Burnside. He crosses the bridges to the south. One bridge in particular is going to take the name as Burnside's Bridge. He's going to be delayed there, but it nearly pierces Lee's lines and damages his army and basically knocks it out of the war. But what happens is that delaying action was important because Jackson's forces, if you guys remember, the ones that took Harper's Ferry, were led by A.P. Hill, and they march quickly from Harper's Ferry to the battlefield and arrive just in time and save the day and prevent the Union Army from routing the Southern forces completely. Now, the effects of this battle, it was a draw, but it became the single bloodiest day in American history. Okay, no other battle in American history, regardless of what war, has produced that many casualties and deaths on the same day. McClellan is going to be relieved of command completely, and that Lincoln is going to be allowed to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Even though it wasn't a complete victory, it does stem the tide. It gives some positive press in the North, and he's able to issue something as important as the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, on to the next major engagement. Ambrose Burnside is going to be put in command of the Army of the Potomac, and he comes up with this very, very bold plan, and he moves his army south across from the town of Fredericksburg. Surprises Lee because of how slow McClellan had been operating previously against him. But the problem is the boats to help his army cross the Rappahannock River, which are between him and Fredericksburg, don't arrive in time, and then Burnside just keeps delaying and allows Lee to catch up. So Lee prepares defensive positions inside the town as delaying actions, and then outside of town there was a series of heights and a stone wall, and that's where he prepared his defensive positions. It was called Marie's Heights. So once Burnside takes the town, he has Lee looking over him on an elevated position, and instead of backing off and maybe finding another position to fight Lee that was more advantageous, he decides against frontal assaults, and they're heavy casualties. It's one of the most one-sided victories in the war, and the Confederates win. Now Burnside, he's not completely deterred. He tries another offensive in January, but it's the winter, and in Virginia there's sleet, a little bit of snow, but it basically muddies all the roads up, and his offensive fails, and it gets known as the Mud March, and he is relieved of command. All right, now the next major action is at Chancellorsville. Now Joseph Hooker, who I mentioned earlier at Antietam, he divides his army. He is much more aggressive than any of the Union commanders before, and his goal is to pin Lee's army and crush it. Use one part of his army to pin him down and the other to outmaneuver and crush him. And he actually starts to do so. But what happens is Lee splits his forces. And he leaves a small delaying force at Fredericksburg. Remember, most of these battles are going to be fought pretty much in the same area. But what happens is Lee uses his main force to attack Hooker's advanced units. Well, Hooker gets scared, even though he had acted really quickly, and he ends up retreating into a defensive position around the town of Chancellorsville. Well, what happens is that allows Lee to figure things out. And although outnumbered, Lee further divides his army. He uses Jackson to flank the Union position. Now, what happened was Jackson had found a route from a farmer that was familiar with the area that allowed him to secretly get around the Union flank, and he opens up an attack that completely flanks the Union 11th Corps, which was on the Union right, and basically routs the entire Union army for a period, but the Union forces are able to regroup, and vicious fighting ensues. Now, the Confederates are going to be on the advantage, or have the advantage at this point, and they're going to win a great victory here. And it's going to crush the Union Army. But what's going to happen is Stonewall Jackson, when he's out patrolling towards dusk, is he's going to actually get mortally wounded by his own troops during one of the nights of the battle, and he's going to die weeks later. And this is going to change a lot of how the South operates in the war, at least in the Eastern Theater, because he's one of their best generals. Now, after this campaign, Lee, again, this is the height of his power. He's defeating everything that's really going against him, and he decides, I'm going to march north again, and it's for the same reasons. He's going to threaten Washington. He's going to take pressure off of Virginia. He really can't go wrong here. Now, in the march north, there's cavalry forces clash at a place called Brandy Station. It's actually the largest cavalry engagement of the war, but that engagement really kicks off Hooker's pursuit of Lee from Virginia up to the north into Maryland and Pennsylvania. Now, the Confederates, they move into Pennsylvania to help resupply, but Hooker is going to be replaced in late June by George Meade, who thought he was being arrested when the orders were being brought to his tent. Now, here we go to perhaps the most famous battle of the war at Gettysburg. Now, the Gettysburg is a 3-day battle. We'll go through each day here. At Gettysburg, it started with Union cavalry. They fight a delaying action northwest of town against infantry of the Confederates, and it buys them time to establish a defensive line kind of to the northwest of town, and troops from Reynolds' 1st Corps and Howard's 11th Corps, the corps that was defeated soundly at Chancellorsville from Jackson's flank attack, come up along McPherson's Ridge and provide a strong defense for the Union forces. Now, over time, more Confederate forces are going to come into the fight. They're going to come along again down on the 11th Corps' flank. They're going to get routed, and that's going to force the Union troops back through town, and they're going to regroup south of town along another hill called Cemetery Hill, and that's going to become a strong defensive position for them. The Confederates rest, and they regroup for the night. Now, the next day, the Union defenses keep getting stronger as more troops are coming into the fold, and they are set up in a fishhook around Cemetery and Culp's Hill, and then down to the south of Cemetery Hill on a ridge called Cemetery Ridge. Now, Lee plans to actually attack around the southern flank, around Cemetery Ridge, but Longstreet doesn't agree with it, and he delays. Well, during that delay, the corps that was operating to the south for the Union Army, Sickles' 3rd Corps, advances without orders because he thinks it's a more advantageous position. Well, it's an exposed position. He gets crushed in actions in the Peach Orchard, the Wheat Field, and Devil's Den because he basically put his troops right in the path of the attack, and there was no way he could stop it. Now, this sends the Union forces scrambling, and there's an action by the 20th Maine at Little Round Top that saves the Union flank and saves the day, as well as there's other actions that save the day as well. Now, there are Confederates also attack on Culp's Hill to the northeast, as well as Cemetery Hill, and these go on into the night, but they fail. And then Lee, one of the reasons why he actually engaged in this action, or the action actually started, was he didn't have his cavalry. His cavalry commander, Jeb Stuart, had kind of ridden off and abandoned the army for a period, so Lee didn't really have a lot of good intelligence at the beginning of this battle. Jeb Stuart finally arrives late on the 2nd. Now, the 3rd and final day of the battle, the attacks on Culp's Hill resume. Now, these attacks were almost as a diversion from what Lee looked at as his main attack, which would come at the center of the Union line, because he hadn't attacked there yet. These fail, however. So what happens is Lee uses all the artillery that he has, and he fires it for 2 hours on Cemetery Ridge at a focal point at a copse of trees, which is going to be known as the Angle. And it was designed to break up the Union defensive positions. Well, the Union artillery fires back. It doesn't have the effect that Lee wants it to, and forces under Pickett are ordered to attack the ridge. They almost break the line at the place I called the Angle, but the attack fails. There's heavy casualties, and it just basically crushes the Army of Northern Virginia at this point. Now, there are other cavalry forces to the east and to the south that fight each other. For example, George Armstrong Custer charges Stuart's cavalry forces as they try to attack the Union flank to the east. He stops that successfully, but really the main action on this day is Pickett's charge. Now the aftermath of this battle is it's a very decisive Union victory. It's the turning point in the war, especially when you combine it with Vicksburg, the Union victory at Vicksburg on the next day. Now this is the largest and deadliest battle of the war, with estimates being anywhere from 46 to 51,000 casualties. However, the Confederate Army escapes at this point and the war continues. Now, at this point we're going to have a shift in the war where we have a new Union commander, Ulysses S. Grant. He's going to assume command in March of 1864 of all Union armies, but he's going to move east from the Western Theater. He is much more aggressive, and he forces the attack against Lee, which is different. And this is going to start with the Overland Campaign, and this campaign is going to be marked by heavy casualties on both sides. But what Grant does that the others don't is he doesn't worry about the casualties. He just keeps pressing the attack. He doesn't let Lee get away from him, which is the mistake that all the other commanders had been doing. So he keeps pressing the attack against Lee. Now, the advantage that Grant had, even though he did not like leading men to their deaths, is that he could replace the casualties and the resources. Lee couldn't. So to continue this, Grant pushes towards Richmond. And as he pushes towards Richmond, through the Overland Campaign and onwards, it leads to what's going to be known as the Siege of Petersburg. Now, Petersburg was an important rail hub outside of Richmond, and the Confederate forces there are able to bog Grant's forces down, and it's going to be a series of attacks on prepared forts and trenches. Think of it as a precursor to what's going to happen in World War I. Now, these actions, it's a siege, it's slow, it's bloody, hard fought. Grant's going to slowly cut the supply lines to Richmond. Now, once that happens, his cavalry commander, Philip Sheridan, is going to win a decisive battle at Five Forks. And when that battle is won, Grant launches an all-out assault on Petersburg, and there's a breakthrough. And that breakthrough comes in part because of overwhelming odds, but also because Lee was slowly backing troops out because his army wasn't going to be able to hold onto that position. Now, on April 6th of 1865, at the Battle of Sailor's Creek, a rearguard action is fought by the Confederate Army, and they lose a fourth of their army that's there because the Union are able to outmaneuver it. Alright, let's move away from middle of Virginia here for just a second. We're going to go back to the Shenandoah Valley. Again, remember, it's the breadbasket of the Confederacy. The Union forces are set down the valley again to capture the agricultural resources of the South. Now, Confederate forces under Jubal Early, who were sent there to fight against this attack, were successful in driving back Union forces, at least initially. They actually get as far as Washington with some skilled maneuvering. But Philip Sheridan, who I just mentioned, is sent to the valley. He begins commanding the Union forces, and he defeats Early, and he begins using what's known as a scorched earth policy in damaging the agricultural productivity of the valley. Now, back to Virginia, or back near Richmond. Okay, Lee, he actually continues to march to safety, but he's starting to get pinned in. And on April 9th of 1865, he actually attacks at a place called Appomattox. This fails, and when it fails, he sees that he's surrounded on three sides. He decides to surrender. And that same day, he meets Grant and surrenders at Appomattox Courthouse. Now, the war doesn't end here, but for all intents and purposes, it's effectively ended with this action. Now, lastly here, we're going to talk about Lincoln's assassination. Now, John Wilkes Booth and a group of conspirators had planned on decapitating the U.S. government. Now, initially, the plan was just to kidnap Lincoln, but it evolved into a plot to kill Lincoln, the Vice President Andrew Johnson, and the Secretary of State William Seward. Now, when the plot unfolds on April 14th of 1865, President Lincoln is assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, as we all know, and he dies the next morning. Seward is attacked, but he had been hurt previously, and he's severely injured. He only survives based on what he was wearing from his injuries beforehand, and the plot against Johnson isn't even carried out because the conspirator gets cold feet. Now, over the next 2 weeks or so, troops actually track down Booth to a place known as Garrett's Farm. They set the barn on fire to get him out, and there's a firefight that ensues, and he's mortally wounded and dies on a porch outside of the burning barn. Now, to conclude this, on July 7th of 1865, the rest of the conspirators, well, not all of them, but a majority of the conspirators, Mary Surratt, Lewis Powell, David Harold, and George Atzerodt, they are executed by hanging for their roles in the plot to assassinate Lincoln after a series of trials. All right, that concludes the actions of the war in the Eastern Theater. We're going to move on to part 2.